evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
That's better. Good evening and welcome to the Fine Arts Center. My name is John Greer. I teach music history and theory here at the center, and tonight I will do my best to give you a peek under the surface of this legendary and deeply personal composition, Dmitri Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8, Opus 110 in C minor. The talented and hardworking students of the Athena Quartet have been playing this challenging piece so well that we thought it a great opportunity to showcase their performance and use it as a springboard to a deeper appreciation of this great masterwork. Violinist Beth Yuchuk and Sarah Leonard, violist Anna Bowden, and cellist Melissa Gaddy will demonstrate some of the most essential elements of this complex and powerful work. The presentation will conclude with a complete and uninterrupted performance of the quartet and time for Q&A after that. We will, of course, be thanking the Athena Quartet for their artistry later on, but before we go any further, we must also thank the person whose guidance has helped these musicians to sound so very good and whose idea this event was. Fine Arts Center's instructor of chamber music, Mr. John Rodman. Yeah, John. Please pay close attention to the presentation and the handout provided, as we may require you to take a brief quiz before we let you leave. Dmitri Shostakovich was born in 1906 in St. Petersburg to parents who supported the 1917 revolution, but who were not Bolsheviks. Like so many legendary composers, he demonstrated enormous talent early on and was admitted to the Petrograd Conservatory at age 13. His development was carefully nurtured by the head of the conservatory, the composer Alexander Glazunov. Shostakovich's parents encouraged this stewardship by providing Glazunov with ample supplies of illicitly obtained vodka, for which Glazunov had an ample appetite. Shostakovich's first symphony was premiered by the Leningrad Philharmonic in 1926 upon his graduation from the conservatory at age 19. The work so impressed conductor Bruno Walter that he programmed it with the Berlin Philharmonic the next year. It was an immediate success. Shostakovich's career proceeded more or less successfully through the 1920s and mid-30s. His politics were somewhat ambiguous, and he was sometimes accused of having insufficient political zeal. In 1926, he failed his first attempt at the required exam in Marxist methodology. He generally managed to do just enough to stay out of trouble with the Soviet regime. In the early years of the Soviet Union, the arts were encouraged to be adventurous and cutting edge, in part to give the impression of an open and progressive society to the West. Shostakovich's early works are among his most risk-taking. For example, in his opera The Nose, premiered in 1930, a government functionary awakens one morning to discover his nose has left his face to lead an independent life and achieve a higher social rank than himself. In what was perhaps a foreshadowing of troubles to come, The Nose was criticized by the Stalinist Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians as being guilty of formalism, the usual accusation leveled at works not deemed to be in adequate sync with the ideology of the government. In January of 1934, Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district was premiered. It tells the tragic story of Katerina Izmailova, who is exploited and humiliated by all of the men in her life, husband, father-in-law, lover, driving her to desperation and murder. The scripting story was a hit with the public and approved by the Soviet cultural apparatus, which said that it, quote, could have been written only by a Soviet composer brought up in the best tradition of Soviet culture, unquote. And thus it ran until January 26, 1936, when Joseph Stalin, who had consolidated his leadership of the Soviet Union in 1929, attended a performance. He left before the last act. 2 days later, an article appeared in Pravda, the official Soviet newspaper, titled Muddle Instead of Music. Though not actually signed by Stalin, the article makes clear that a new policy of the state concerning its artists had come into being, and Lady Macbeth was being used as an example of all that was wrong with works like it. The fourth paragraph of the article concludes with a chilling statement, quote, "The ability of good music to enthrall the masses has been sacrificed on the altar of petty bourgeois formalism. This is playing at abstruseness, and such games can only finish badly." Unquote. 1936 also saw the beginning of Stalin's Great Terror, which would ultimately claim the lives of roughly 20 million Soviet citizens. Many of Shostakovich's friends and colleagues were killed or imprisoned. Performances dried up. His income plummeted. His Fifth Symphony of 1937 returns to a safer, more conservative style. And an article in a Moscow newspaper attributed to Shostakovich describes the work as, quote, "the response of a Soviet artist to just criticism," unquote. Shostakovich's music, along with that of Sergei Prokofiev, Aram Khachaturian, and many others, was condemned and accused of formalism again in 1948 in the Zhdanov Decree, which put forth a policy formulated by a member of the Communist Party's Central Committee, Andrei Zhdanov. Most of Shostakovich's works were banned, and he was forced to repent publicly. A friend said that Shostakovich told him that during this period he slept in the hallway by the elevator with his bag packed so that his family would not be disturbed when the secret police came for him. Soviet artists in general, cowed by their fear of official disapproval, produced little of depth or lasting value during this time. A thaw in the relationship between artists and the regime began in 1952 with the retraction of the Zhdanov Doctrine, and even more importantly with the death of Stalin in 1953. Shostakovich saw his works performed again, including many that were written earlier when they had no hope of performance. The 1950s were difficult, however, as Shostakovich endured the deaths of his mother and first wife, divorce from his second wife, and being diagnosed with myelitis, a debilitating nerve disease that gradually robbed him of control of his right hand. And then, in 1960, he did something that he had managed to avoid through the entire Stalinist period. He joined the Communist Party. This has been variously interpreted as capitulation, cowardice, or perhaps genuine commitment. His widow claims that he was blackmailed, and his friend Isaac Glickman reports that because of it, Shostakovich was racked with suicidal despair just before writing this quartet. Glickman, by the way, of the many sources we have about Shostakovich, Glickman is considered one of the most dependable. His diary is a wealth of information about Shostakovich. The Eighth Quartet was composed in 3 days, July 12th through 14th, 1960, in the German town of Gorisch, near the city of Dresden. Dresden was a cultural center of little military importance that was nonetheless firebombed to the ground by the Allies in February of 1945. Shostakovich toured the ruins and spoke with survivors. He had gone there to compose music for a film about Russian soldiers saving art treasures from Dresden, but instead, he composed the Eighth Quartet. In a letter to his friend Glickman, he described it as, quote, "an ideologically deficient quartet that nobody needs," unquote. He also described it as a pseudo-tragic quartet over which he shed tears by the bucket. The 5 movements are titled simply with their tempos: slow, very fast, moderately fast, slow, and very slow, and are played without pauses in between. That Shostakovich himself is in the quartet, there can be no doubt. The very first notes are those of his musical signature, as notated in your handout. His initials in German, D, S, C, H. All right, so let me explain how we get these letters out of those 4 notes. First note is D, and D is simply D. In German, E flat is spelled ace, E-S, so he borrows the S from that. The German spelling of Shostakovich's name requires a C, so there's the C. And in German nomenclature, the note B flat is called B, and B natural is called H, which is why Bach's name can be spelled in notes in German. B flat, A, C, B natural, okay? So that's how he gets his initials DSCH. And Missy will now play DSCH for us. Now we're all going to sing it. La la la. Ready? La 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 la. That wasn't too bad. Let's try it once more. Ready? La 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 la. Carnegie Hall. Here we come. Now the entire quartet will play the opening, and you can hear how Shostakovich's signature is used in all four parts. And then, in case you missed it, he presents the motive again about halfway through the first movement in one bold unison statement. In the second movement, he presents it in faster rhythms and in a manner similar to a round. In the third movement, the motive is repeated insistently in the violin melody. This passage is obviously influenced by the Danse Macabre of Camille Saint-Saëns. Later in the third movement, it appears again, this time in a style that is reminiscent of Jewish klezmer music. The DSCH motive is absent from the fourth movement until the very end, in a transition to the last movement. The last movement is very much a reflection of the first, and you will hear the DSCH motive in a similar way. Now, Shostakovich had used this device before in his 10th Symphony, the cello concerto of the previous year, and in other pieces later on, but never so obsessively as in this quartet. Clearly, the point behind the quartet, whatever it is, involves him. And there are many other quotations from earlier Shostakovich compositions. In the first movement, you will hear a theme from his first symphony, the work that catapulted Shostakovich to fame. In the second movement, you will hear a strong allusion to his 8th Symphony of 1943. This symphony, composed in C minor, as is this quartet, is regarded by scholars as a work of tremendous intellectual depth. His friend Glickman described it as Shostakovich's most tragic symphony, which, by the way, is saying something. And owing to its dark tone, the regime regarded it as unsuitable for propaganda purposes. And it was banned by the Zhdanov decree of 1948 and not performed again until 1956. Shostakovich's style often includes elements of the grotesque, and this passage has been described by some as the music of outrage. There are similar passages in symphonies, later symphonies, that are thought to be descriptions of Stalin. At 2 points later in the second movement, you will hear a theme emulating the sound of Jewish folk music. This theme is actually a quotation borrowed from his piano trio, Opus 67, of 1944, where it appears in the last movement. This work was premiered just as the atrocities of the Nazi death camps were being exposed, and this theme was quickly associated with the Holocaust. Though himself an atheist, Shostakovich campaigned against Soviet anti-Semitism and always at some personal risk. There are many indications that he identified with the plight of the Jews. He loved the language of Jewish folk music, describing it as laughing through tears. In the third movement, there is a very clear quotation of the principal theme from Shostakovich's cello concerto of 1959, which he had composed for his friend, the legendary cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. This theme is similar to the DSCH motive and is also related to a theme from the composer's score for the 1948 film The Young Guard, which depicts a group of Soviet soldiers being marched to their deaths at the hands of the Nazis. The fourth movement is the dramatic climax of the quartet and is the only movement to quote melodies with texts. The transition to the fourth movement is a simple violin solo that incorporates the beginning of the Gregorian chant, Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath. This is a funereal chant made first famous by quotation in the Symphonie Fantastique of 1830 by Hector Berlioz, and used again by many composers since as a symbol of death. A shadow of this melody can be heard again in the middle and at the end of the movement. So first we'll have Anna Catherine play for us the first two phrases of the original Dies Irae. And now Beth will play the 5 notes that Shostakovich quotes. The last note of this melody lingers quietly while dramatic events, harmonically unrelated, happen all around it. 2 groups of 3 harsh chords are hammered out, followed by a slower 3-note motive. This pattern is repeated twice more and followed by the second allusion to the Dies Irae. The lone low note in the first violin is variously interpreted as the distant droning of bombers, or, more likely, a person in hiding. The 3 slower notes are often thought to be an allusion to the last movement of Beethoven's last string quartet, at the top of which Beethoven writes a very similar three-note motive and puts to these notes the enigmatic question, muss es sein, which in German means, must it be? The chords have been interpreted either as the falling of bombs, as at Dresden, or more likely, the knock on the door of the secret police in the middle of the night. Either of these is followed sensibly by the symbol of death, the Dies Irae. Next follows an allusion to the opera Lady Macbeth, a low unison melody used as a transition after the scene in which Katharina has just murdered her father-in-law. Remarkable quotation, a Russian prison song translated variously as tormented by harsh captivity or languishing in prison, other titles, other translations, known to be a favorite song of the leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin. Was this included as a genuine tribute to Lenin, a leader who might now be missed since the ascendance of Stalin? Or was this included as a sort of political safety buffer for Shostakovich? Or does he see himself as a prisoner? Perhaps there's an answer in the next quotation, Katharina's deeply sorrowful lament from Act 4 of Lady Macbeth. Whatever its precise meaning, it is unlikely a coincidence that Shostakovich quotes so boldly and at such a dramatically important moment the work with which began his most difficult relations with the Soviet regime back in 1934, difficulties from which he never fully recovered. This is all followed by one more utterance of the knocking music, but this time with the low note of the bombers or a person in hiding missing. The movement concludes with a sort of merging of the Dies Irae fragment with the DSCH motive, with which it moves without pause into the fifth movement. This last movement is much like the first, but it's as if the music is completely drained of any further capacity for resistance. All of the instruments quote a melodic fragment that appears in Lady Macbeth in three places, most prominently in a passage from the beginning of the final act in which a prison gang that includes Katharina is marching across Siberia. page of the quartet bears the inscription, "To the victims of fascism." His son, Maxim, believes that this is a reference to the victims of all totalitarianism. His daughter, Galina, claims that Shostakovich dedicated it to himself, and that the published dedication was dictated by the authorities. Shostakovich's friend, Lev Lebedinsky, said that Shostakovich thought of the work as his suicide note. Much of what we think we know about Shostakovich's life as a composer in the USSR comes from testimony. And there's a copy of testimony in the music stand outside if you'd like to have a look, which is claimed to be his memoir as dictated to the Russian musicologist Solomon Volkov and smuggled out of the Soviet Union in 1979. Shostakovich's daughter Galina and his son Maxim, who is now a famous conductor, both believe that testimony is essentially authentic. His widow Irina says it is not, claiming that Volkov only met with Shostakovich 3 or 4 times. Maxim Shostakovich has clarified by saying that the book is about Shostakovich, not by him. Volkov suggests that Shostakovich adopt the role of the Uroddevi, that is, holy fool, in his relationship with the government. Scholar Laurel Fay denies the authenticity of testimony, claiming that Volkov cobbled it together from recycled articles, gossip, and possibly some information direct from the composer. Scholar Richard Taruskin is of the opinion that the book does reflect Shostakovich's conversations with Volkov, but that it was Shostakovich's attempt to reinvent himself as a dissident to protect his image after his death. Though current scholarship seems to lean towards skepticism of testimony, the debate goes on. Instrumental music, by its very nature, is limited in its ability to deliver specific messages. This quartet is loaded with quotations and allusions that have potent historical associations and must mean something. But what? Much like 18th century composers trying to cut through the dense curtain of censorship maintained by European monarchies, Shostakovich was not free in any public forum to be truthful about his feelings. Though Shostakovich was clearly not a closeted liberal capitalist, his relationship with the Soviet regime was highly problematic. Was he trying to tell the world of his troubles with his quartet? Or are we Westerners inclined to hear one of our favorite storylines, the troubled genius struggling against a tyrannical and alien regime? We must be cautious and open to complexity and ambiguity. Musicologist David Fanning, an acknowledged expert on Shostakovich, comes to the reasonable conclusion that, quote, amid the conflicting pressures of official requirements, the mass suffering of his fellow countrymen, and his personal ideals of humanitarian and public service, Shostakovich succeeded in forging a musical language of colossal emotional power, unquote. Above all, I think we need to be able to hear the obvious tragedy and warnings of danger to the human spirit sounded in this quartet, a message that is universal, whether or not it is Shostakovich's life exactly. It is a real honor and an enormous privilege to work with young people as remarkable as these. They've put in a lot of hard work on this, and I've enjoyed every minute of it, guys. Thanks. It's good. And so I give you the Athena Quartet performing Dmitri Shostakovich's String Quartet number 8 in C minor, Opus 110. Thank you.
John came up with it for us.
John.
I originally named the quartet after my daughter. I thought that wasn't quite appropriate. Athena is the goddess of war, and she's also the goddess of art, and it seemed appropriate for this piece. For the
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
How long have you been working on this?
September. Since September. Since September.
Translation forever. Yes, sir.
Would Shostakovich have been likely to have known who would perform this, and would he have contoured anything at all towards the players involved?
Interesting question. Quite possibly. I'm speculating, but there was a quartet called Beethoven Quartet, legendary, terrific quartet, who premiered all of his string quartets through, I want to say, 10 or 11. He wrote, I believe it was 15 of them in the end, and they did the most of them as premieres. So, yeah, he would have worked quite closely with them. But, he did this in 3 days on his own. So while he was probably hearing the sound of the Beethoven Quartet, it's not like he asked anyone about it in the process of composing. Yeah. Interesting question. Composer, that really happens. I mean, if you're accustomed to working with certain musicians, then the things that they're good at, the things they like to do, you remember that and you try to do more of it generally, yes. And not do the things they complain about. Yes, ma'am.
Having gone through your theory class, I feel like I should know this. But
I'm going to go back and change your grade now.
did Shostakovich hear this premiere? I don't remember. Was it like during when he was alive?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was premiered, I believe, November of 1960. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, very definitely.
Not in USSR. In the USSR?
Yes. Yes. Going back to this whole business about instrumental music being, not particularly well adapted to delivering, specific messages, the advantage is in that it's the least censorable of the arts. It seems pretty clear, for example, that Beethoven in some of his symphonies was saying things that the censors could never figure out, right? Of course, you had to be sort of inside, to know what the message was. But there is a line in Testimony. Who knows if this is, actually his words or not? But in Testimony, Shostakovich's line about the Eighth Quartet is, he says, "My Eighth Quartet, the meaning of it is clear as a primer." Meaning, as a school child's primer. Yes, sir.
What was the cause of Shostakovich's death?
I believe the official cause was lung cancer. He was not a particularly sunny individual, and you can understand that. But his chemistry in general was not real bright up. And the circumstances probably just made it worse. And he did, in spite warnings, had a taste for cigarettes and vodka, which he just could not give up. And so, yeah, he pretty much just decayed. Yes, ma'am.
Given what you were saying about music being harder to get subtle messages from than maybe some of the other arts, how did the government officials install and figure out that it was offensive?
You're referring probably to Lady Macbeth, the opera? Well, it was, my read on this is that it was not so much a matter of that piece being any worse than any other. They just decided it was time to do something. And, I mean, there were pieces before that were the same, and no one said anything about it. Stalin was simply, tightening his grip. And I'm sure thought that it was good to strike a little fear into his artists generally. And after that, I mean, it really worked. People became very, very frightened. And they said stuff about, like, it has some moments in it that sound vaguely, like at least referencing jazz, and that was a very bad thing. Never mind, there was a Soviet jazz quartet later on. They were really good. But, Stalin had to die before that could happen. And I read another line. It was interesting. Another functionary wrote something about this whole incident, saying that it wasn't so much that they wanted to throttle Shostakovich as much as they thought Shostakovich, of all the composers that they had with them, that Shostakovich was worth saving. And so they wanted to shunt his talent in the direction that served the state. Yes, ma'am?
Is it known when he made his first quartet?
The first quartet? It's known. I'm sorry, I don't. Well, I think it was right about the time. Now that I think about it, it was right about the time of Lady Macbeth. That's a good question. So that would have been 34, 35, around in there. Did I put it in there? Oh, should have my memory's like. And it's very clear, as many composers have, he reached for the string quartet as a compact, compelling medium that was not so public to display some of his, truer feelings. Symphonies became, propaganda devices, at least outwardly, right? But with a little string quartet that wasn't going to, be really publicly visible, not so much. He could be a little more honest. Yes, ma'am.
With the BSCH,
Mhm.
what does it stand for? I know it stands for his initials, but they're
Yeah, it's the German spelling of his name. That's where the fourth letter comes from. Usually when we spell his name in English, it's just S-H-O, no C. But when it's spelled in German, you need a C. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir.
What did the Soviets mean by the word formalism?
Good question. Okay, here are the two polarities in art. There's classical versus romantic, and they get called other names, but this is the polarity. If the art object is classical, that means it's basically about itself, its own stuff, and it doesn't necessarily reference anything outside of itself. On the other hand, art that is romantic is about something. 19th century music, romantic period music, is almost always about something. It's trying to tell a story or deliver an image or a philosophical track. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, but it's about something, quite intentionally. The Soviets thought that the classical end of things was just a lot of self-indulgent fiddling, with art, when art should be serving the people. There evolved a doctrine called socialist realism, or sometimes Soviet realism, which meant that the art should address the people very directly as to, how they should feel great about the state and should give their all to its betterment and this kind of thing. So all art was seen as being in service of the people. And there's even a line from Shostakovich where he says, we think, if I fail to make myself clear to the audience, I have failed. Whatever that means. Good question. I mean, that shades everything in Soviet music, and so there is a tendency toward program music then, music that tries to tell stories and so forth. And that's not even a Soviet thing. That goes all the way back to the end of the 19th century when Russian composers like Bordin and Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov set out to write really, really Russian music. We said, we don't want to be like the Germans anymore. We're going to write Russian music. And to do that, we need to tell Russian stories. And so this was not an invention of the Communist Party. They adapted it to their needs. Yes, sir?
Did Shostakovich have a favorite composers when he had any?
He was influenced by many people, yes. Well, first of all composers are impressed with Bach, and you can hear some of that in this. In the 1930s, a friend introduced him to the work of Gustav Mahler, and he was very impressed with that. And so the sort of grand landscape sort of thing that his symphonies tend to do is pretty clearly modeled on that of Mahler, who, his symphonies require, 2 hours in a small town to do them. So, that kind of, big event with a capital B, that was something that he was reaching for as looking back at Mahler. And he certainly admired the work of many of his colleagues in all of the arts. The relationship between Shostakovich and Prokofiev, though, was kind of like two cats circling each other. A little bit thorny. Yes, ma'am? Did he teach? Yes, he did. Not a real lot of students, but enough to make a difference, and some of them are still working in Russia now. Yes.
Did he play an instrument?
He was a pretty fair pianist and started off as a prize-winning pianist, although people thought his playing was a little bit inexpressive. He nonetheless won a prize or two, but then he kind of gave up performing after that. The premiere of the Opus 67 piano trio that was mentioned, that was quoted, he played the piano in the premiere of that. Yes, sir?
Was he allowed to travel during this time?
Yes. In fact, after the Zhdanov decree, he was rehabilitated by the regime enough to come to New York in 1949, but he was obviously nervous. And, people were encouraging him to defect and, and answering him some probing question, he would answer with a comment about the weather or something. It was really dodgy. It's quite a story. You can't make this stuff up. I don't know when the movie's coming, but there really should be one. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the relationship between Prokofiev and Shostakovich. You think it's possible Shostakovich had any kind of jealousy of Prokofiev? I think Prokofiev went to Hollywood and started doing movies. Could you personally have envisioned Shostakovich ever even doing anything like that? Or do you think, obviously he must have been financially rewarded more than Shostakovich would have been at that time?
Oh, I don't know. It was really complicated. Jealousy, sure. I mean, most composers are jealous.
More money in the Hollywood things,
Yeah, I might have guessed that Shostakovich might have seen Prokofiev as a little bit shallow, maybe opportunistic. I don't know, because Prokofiev did have, a professional life in the West, and then voluntarily came back to the Soviet Union, and then got ensnared in all this stuff, right? But there's an interesting story about Prokofiev. He died on the same day as Stalin, and they delayed announcing it for 3 days so that it would not overshadow Stalin's funeral. Yes, sir? You have a question? Yeah, you.
I'd like to know from the string quartet, how is it that you came to spend 6 months of your life? And since there's been talk about meaning or message, how is you, as you spent these months working on this piece, did you come to, how did you figure out what Shostakovich was up to? Or did you figure out what Shostakovich was up to?
Well, we began playing the quartet, and our coach actually thought it would be a good idea when we had the concert to maybe explain it, because there are so many quotes and references in it, and it'd be really helpful to explain that to an audience so they could kind of be in on the message. As for figuring out the messages, I thought it was very helpful in studying the quartet, because you really get to see and work with all the quotes and all of the little bits of melody that he references in the quartet, and so it really helps you piece together what he was trying to say.
And I don't think we'll ever totally understand what Shostakovich is trying to tell us, because, I mean, we're privileged teenagers in America in 2010, and he wrote in a totally different time, and as much as we'll try to understand it, I don't think we'll ever fully understand it. Lots of
Yes, ma'am.
what other instruments and how many instruments is Shostakovich?
Did you play? My understanding is really nothing much beyond the piano. But composers always study how to write for the other instruments. You can learn how to do that without actually playing one. I personally cannot play a scale on a stringed instrument, but I talk to string instrument players a lot. Sometimes I'll think of something and I'll say, "Can you do this?" Usually they say no.
Write it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. We act like we're listening. Is there anything else? Okay, you've been a terrific audience. It's really been fun, and because of that, I guess we'll let you out of the quiz. But in exchange, we hope you'll stop and look at our shameless commerce division, the merchandise table out front, and let's give our players one more round of applause.